Hi guys, Natalie here. I have just finished putting together my bowl of curry and I am ready to talk about death. So I just finished reading Death's storyline in the Discworld series, and it's comprised of 4 books: Mort, Reaperman, Soul Music, and the Hogfather. So instead of doing just a normal book review, I decided to do a storyline review because Terry Pratchett has so many books, and it's almost easier to understand why the books are great if you understand a storyline that follows a main character. So let's talk about Death. Death is an interesting character. He's one of the most famous anthropomorphic personifications of death. Basically, that just means he's a walking, talking person who happens to have the job of ferrying souls to the other world. Or, in Discworld's case, wherever newly dead people believe they're going to go. Terry Pratchett has a really interesting way of approaching a death character. He takes all of our stereotypes, the scythe skeleton in a dark cloak. He adds flaming blue orbs that are eyes, a horse named Binky, and a total lack of sense of humor, love of curry, and love of cats. And you've basically got death in all caps. But what's funny about it is because he's so removed from the rest of the world, he becomes very curious about humanity. Terry Pratchett, as an author, was described by one of his good friends, Neil Gaiman, as very angry under the surface and driven by that passion. And that came out in a very fantastic, witty, butt-biting satire that is known as Discworld. So the death character in his miniseries is in a perfect place to create a commentary on humanity. Let me go ahead and run through the books. So the first one is Mort. So you start out this introduction of death in Discworld by a young boy off getting an apprenticeship with death. What a weird and creepy apprenticeship. This story starts to get interesting when Death decides to take a job vacation. While Death is off having his own little fun, discovering what it means to be human, Mort starts to have an interesting time trying to keep a young woman alive and trying to figure out how to keep existence spinning because her death has not happened. So the main theme of this book is a common one throughout the death storyline, and it's just the concept that we can accept death while still being able to love. You have to have both, and both of them make life worth living. So Reaperman starts out with the Auditors. These are creatures that make sure that the universe continues working. In Mort, Death started to have more of a personality, and that's not allowed for anthropomorphic personifications that have a duty. So they decide that he has to go. And so Death is no longer Death, and he has to try to live a normal life. Meanwhile, you have this crazy side story that's going on at the Unseen University with all of the magicians there. So as far as themes go for this book, it really is for Death specifically the will to survive and the will to be alive. He learns why life is meaningful even though they know they're going to die someday. So the next book I don't have with me, but it's Soul Music. So the book starts out with a tragedy. Death has to release someone into death that he doesn't want to. And he ends up feeling what we would describe as immense grief, but what he doesn't really know how to describe except the longing to forget. Death can't forget anything, and something interesting we learn in this novel is that he remembers the future as well as his past and the present. And so, even though he knew the tragedy was coming, he couldn't stop it because it was his duty to let it happen, and now he can't forget it, and so he's having a hard time moving on. And so once again, as is true to Death form, he abandons his post as Death. He essentially goes out looking for human solutions to forget things. Meanwhile, you have a brand new character introduced to the Death storyline. Her name is Susan. So she is actually Death's granddaughter, and she becomes Death. So as she's attempting to do Death's job for him while he is missing in action, we get into the side storyline. So the side storyline follows the main character, Imp E. Sellen. And he is a very good harpist, and he goes to Ankh-Morpork to try to become a real musician, which eventually becomes a parody of what the rock and roll Elvis fanaticism was. Once again, the magicians are a part of this story, and they get really caught up in this rock and roll craze, and It's just fun. So the themes of soul music kind of harken back to the themes of Mort, because Susan is essentially like Mort was. Mort was the apprentice, Susan's just related. They both get shafted with this job of being Death while Death is AWOL, and they kind of have to learn similar lessons. So the theme is that you need to be able to accept death. Something Susan struggles with is the idea that it's not fair. What she has to learn is that death is the great equalizer because it comes to everybody, even if it's not equal when it comes. And similarly, Death himself has to remember his duty. So next we have Hogfather. I've already talked about this a little bit because I just finished reading it, but just as a quick recap, Susan is quite a bit older. She's not asked to be Death again, but she is asked to try to figure out what has happened to the Hogfather indirectly. Needless to say, the Hogfather has vanished. We know that he's been assassinated. And Death, in an effort to save Hogswatch, which is a parody of Christmas, decides to take the job. So here is Death running around on his, well, technically he's riding around on his sleigh pulled by hogs in his fun little Hogfather suit, getting into the jolliness of Hogswatch and incessantly practicing his ho-ho-ho. So then we get into some of the themes of this novel. The main theme is what is equal about Hogswatch. Not much. People hope for things, they hope for gifts, they hope for what they need, but it comes based on their class. High class, low class, wealthy, poor, you know? Whereas Death realizes that similarly to the previous novel in soul music, that Death really is the great equalizer and that at least he is fair. So Death finds it very upsetting that people don't expect him to be fair. Another theme is just what it means to be kind, and that hope, though beneficial, isn't necessarily put into reality unless we are kind. And that's the storyline of Death in Terry Pratchett. It's a great storyline. If you don't know where to get started with Terry Pratchett, I highly recommend Death. He tries so hard to understand humans and to become like them to a certain extent. And what's kind of interesting about the whole thing is he becomes more like them than he realizes. And in the meantime, we get to self-reflect on what it means to be human and some of the fundamental issues that we face as humanity and the way that we do things. So that's a little bit about Death in his 4 books, Mort, Reaperman, Soul Music, and Hogfather. I highly recommend them. They're fun, they're fast, they're hilarious, and to be totally honest, it's Sir Terry Pratchett. So go ahead and look them up and have a great time reading them. Also, if you guys want to subscribe, there's a button right here, and you can come back and see more on Novel Thoughts. Bye, guys.